There are moments in sports that expose something far deeper than what happened on the track. Atlanta Motor Speedway, February 2026, was one of those moments. Carson Hocevar, a 22-year-old Cup Series driver, became the center of one of the most heated controversies NASCAR has faced in years. What unfolded wasn't just a racing incident, it was a flashpoint. Veteran drivers didn't just complain privately, they went public, loudly, directly, with the kind of frustration that doesn't come from one bad race. It comes from pressure that has been building for a long time. Ask yourself this: why would seasoned professionals risk their relationships and public image to call out a young competitor by name? What does it say about a sport when its own athletes feel so unheard that public confrontation becomes their only tool? NASCAR is not just a racing series. It is a multi-billion-dollar ecosystem employing tens of thousands of people. It represents a deeply embedded part of American identity. When its drivers are publicly at war, and when the governing body appears slow to respond, fan trust erodes. Sponsorships wobble. The business model that keeps the sport alive comes under real pressure. The Atlanta fallout matters because it reflects a system under strain, and understanding that strain requires looking far beyond one driver and one race. NASCAR did not arrive at this moment overnight. The sport spent the early 2000s at its commercial peak, strong ratings, sold-out tracks, mainstream sponsorship. Then attendance began declining around 2008. Television viewership followed. NASCAR responded with rule changes, car redesigns, and playoff format overhauls. The next-gen car, introduced in 2022, was the sport's most ambitious modernization effort in a generation. Designed to reduce costs and level the playing field, it carried sound intentions. But it introduced unintended consequences, particularly around pack racing at superspeedways, where close quarters, high-speed contact became a recurring source of driver frustration. Atlanta, with its high banking and multi-wide racing, amplified every flaw in the new aerodynamic package. What was sold as a competitive equalizer began to feel, to many drivers, like a chaos machine without adequate accountability attached to it. The Carson Hocevar situation didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from years of unresolved tension between the sport's ambitions and the realities experienced by the people actually driving the cars at 190 miles per hour. To understand why drivers lashed out publicly, you need to understand superspeedway racing and the accountability structures, or lack of them, that govern driver conduct in NASCAR today. At superspeedways, cars travel separated by inches. Drivers depend on drafting partners to maintain competitive speed. This creates an interdependence unlike almost any other sport. Your performance is partly determined by people you cannot fully control. In this environment, trust is a competitive resource. When a driver develops a reputation for reckless moves, for prioritizing individual gain over the collective rhythm of the pack, other drivers notice. They warn each other. And when warnings go unheeded, and when officiating doesn't adequately penalize dangerous behavior, that frustration moves from the garage into public statements. The core mechanism here is a misalignment between risk and consequence. In a sport where one wrong move can end a career or a life, drivers expect dangerous behavioral patterns to be addressed swiftly. When they aren't, the informal social contract that makes pack racing survivable begins to erode. That erosion is what Atlanta exposed. Not simply one reckless driver, a structural gap between the danger drivers accept and the accountability the system provides. The fallout from Atlanta didn't stay on the track. It moved through NASCAR's broader ecosystem almost immediately, touching sponsor relationships, team dynamics, media coverage, and fan perception at the same time. Sponsors are acutely sensitive to negative headlines. When prominent drivers publicly imply the sanctioning body isn't doing enough, marketing executives begin asking uncomfortable questions about whether this is the brand environment they invested in. The best comparison is the 2023 Las Vegas incident involving Kyle Busch and Ricky Stenhouse Jr., where post-race contact escalated into a physical confrontation. NASCAR fined Stenhouse. Sponsors watched closely. That single event generated weeks of news cycles and forced multiple teams into damage control mode. Atlanta 2026 carries similar energy, but higher stakes. Multiple drivers spoke publicly. The sport is fighting harder than ever for younger audiences. And today's digital media environment amplifies every word of driver frustration into instant viral content. One incident, multiple cascading effects. That is how systemic pressure works inside a complex organization. Most mainstream coverage framed the Atlanta fallout as a drama story. Drivers angry at a young hothead. Personalities clash. NASCAR in chaos. It performs well on social platforms, but it fundamentally misrepresents what is actually happening. This is not a personality conflict. It is a governance story. The surface narrative focuses on Hocevar as an individual, his youth, his aggression, his apparent disregard for racing etiquette. That framing is convenient because it's simple, but Hocevar is operating within a system that created the conditions for this conflict. The car's aerodynamic characteristics, the track configuration, the officiating standards, these are structural factors. They don't get resolved by publicly vilifying one driver. Serious observers should be asking different questions entirely. What specific rule changes has NASCAR implemented in response? How transparent is the officiating review process? What authority do driver safety committees actually hold? Those questions don't generate as many clicks, but they are the ones that determine whether this sport solves its real problem or simply waits for the next version of the same crisis. NASCAR is at a genuine inflection point. Its traditional fan base is aging. Efforts to attract younger viewers have produced mixed results. And its core product continues to generate debate about whether rule changes are improving competition or manufacturing artificial chaos. Over the next decade, driver safety governance will face increasing scrutiny. As the sport competes for elite talent, its ability to demonstrate credible accountability will become a genuine competitive differentiator. Drivers have more options than ever. A sport that cannot demonstrate fair governance risks losing its most marketable athletes. Media rights renewal negotiations, coming in the late 2020s, will be directly influenced by viewership trends and the sport's cultural reputation. Controversies like Atlanta either become cautionary tales or catalysts for growth. That outcome depends entirely on how NASCAR's leadership chooses to respond in the months ahead. International expansion also remains an underexplored frontier. Formula One's global growth proved that American motorsport audiences exist well beyond traditional NASCAR geography. Whether NASCAR can translate its domestic drama into genuine international interest remains an open and important question. Why should someone who doesn't follow NASCAR closely care about any of this? Because what is happening inside NASCAR reflects forces operating across American professional sports broadly. Questions about institutional accountability, about how governing bodies balance competitive freedom with participant safety, about whether organizations prioritize short-term entertainment value over long-term structural health. NASCAR directly anchors local economies in North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida. When the sport's governance is in question, those economic ecosystems feel real uncertainty. For anyone interested in how American institutions manage internal pressure, the months following Atlanta will be genuinely instructive. Watch whether NASCAR announces specific rule clarifications. Watch how leadership communicates publicly with its driver community. Watch whether sponsors issue statements. These are the indicators that reveal organizational health far more accurately than any single race result. If this kind of structural analysis adds value to how you understand sports and American institutions, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who thinks critically about the systems around them. Step back from the racetrack. Step back from the driver names and the lap counts. What Atlanta 2026 ultimately reveals is something universal. Every institution carries the accumulated weight of its own decisions. Rules that seemed reasonable at one point create unintended consequences later. Cultural norms that once held behavior in check begin eroding when enforcement becomes inconsistent. And eventually, the people who bear the most risk feel compelled to speak. That is what NASCAR's drivers did at Atlanta. They spoke, not through official channels, not with perfect strategy, but loudly, publicly, and in a way that could not be ignored. History is consistent on this point. Institutions that respond to internal signals with transparency and genuine structural change tend to emerge stronger. Institutions that respond with defensiveness or cosmetic adjustments tend to face the same crisis again. larger. A few years later, accountability deferred is always accountability compounded, and the voices of those closest to the risk are almost always the first to know when a system is beginning to fail. The only question that remains is whether the people in charge are actually listening.